let me put everything together from this module into these decision trees now as just a little summary for you. And then going forward, you can utilize this decision tree in addition to the ones from modules 9 and 8 and 7. And hopefully that will help you just structure your thinking for a lot of these problems. So in this module, we have talked about two sample hypothesis tests, some that involve means, some that involve proportions. When they involve means, we have to ask ourselves, are the two samples independent or are the two samples paired? And we've seen that when the two samples are independent, we end up using the tool in the calculator 2SAMP t-test. When the two samples are paired, we end up using t-test, and a lot of times we end up using L3, where we end up saying L3 is equal to like L1 minus L2. Sometimes it's actually going to be L2 minus L1. You're going to have to kind of pay close attention to that and interpret things correctly in those problems. Now, one thing I think that you should add to these decision trees, and you can add to these in the notes, is the typical hypotheses that we see when we're working with the particular tools. So whenever we are working with 2SAMP t-test, it seems like our hypotheses are the following. Mu1 is often equal to mu2, and the alternate hypothesis is that mu1 is either greater than mu2, or maybe mu1 is less than mu2, or mu1 is not equal to mu2. Okay, now whenever we're working with t-test in this context of reducing the two sample problem to a single sample problem and we're looking at differences, it seemed pretty typical to have hypotheses where the null was the average difference was equal to 0 for the null, and the alternate would be the average difference was maybe not equal to 0, or maybe it was greater than 0, or maybe it was less than 0. But quite often 0 was that number that we were looking at least in the examples that we've seen so far. I do know that you will run into some problems in the homework where sometimes you'll be using t-test like this, and you'll be starting with a two sample problem, reduce it to a single sample, and the average difference is not 0 for the null. So pay attention to that also. But most of the time, these will be your hypotheses for 2SAMP t-test and t-test. And then your hypotheses, when you're doing a two sample hypothesis test involving proportions and using 2-prop c-test, those hypotheses are typically the null is P1 is equal to P2, and the alternate P1 is not equal to P2, or maybe it's P1 is less than P2, or P1 is greater than P2. So I think that this is a really good way to structure your thinking about these tests in this module. And one final point, you'll see when you look at the notes that I've included the assumptions on this two sample hypothesis test decision tree page. And so there are certain assumptions that I'm not mentioning in here, and most of those are sample size assumptions that need to be met in order to assume that certain distributions are going to be approximately normal and things like that. And so we've seen this consistently throughout the latter half of this course. So a lot of the assumptions like up here would be that your sample size needs to be at least 30. And down here with the proportions, it's also you also have assumptions that address the sample size sufficiency condition. And like I said, those are in the notes. And so just be aware that we can't automatically always jump to these tests unless those assumptions are also met.